Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Rich Clark. I've been a hypnotherapist for the last 8 years and I've been a holistic therapist for the last 14 years. And I'm going to talk about the second part of Truthful Tuesday today. I talked about dying, but I'm going to talk about grief. Now, grief is the response to the loss of something deemed important, particularly to the loss of someone or something that has died, to which a bond or an affection was formed. Although conventionally focused on the emotional response to loss, grief also has physical, cognitive, behavioural, social conditioning, spiritual and philosophical dimensions. Whilst the term is often used interchangeably, bereavement refers to the state of loss, while grief is the reaction to that loss. So, grief is associated with death, is familiar to most people, but individuals grieve in connection with a variety of losses through their lives, such as unemployment, ill health, or the end of a relationship. So we have different ways of grieving. So the grieving process, there was extensive scepticism about a universal and predictable emotional pathway that leads from distress to recovery. And people have got different ideas about this, about how the model of bereavement, two-track models, track one, they say it's two-track models by a guy called Simon Shimron Rubin. He discussed track one is formed on the biopsychosocial functioning of grief, the focus on the anxiety, depression, somatic concerns, traumatic responses, familiar relationships, interpersonal relationships, self-esteem, meaning, structure, and work and investment in life tasks. Rubin points out track one is the range of aspects of the individual's function across effective interpersonal issues. All of the terms listed above are noted for the importance that they have in relation to people's responses to grief and loss. Track one, because this can determine the severity of the grief and the grief that bereaved will endure. And then what we look at how that's triggered. Now the second track focuses on the ongoing relationship between the griever and the deceased. Track two mainly focuses on how the bereaved was connected to the deceased and how on what level of closeness was shared. And the memory could also be triggered for the bereaved, the way they bereaved chose to remember their loved ones. So something can happen, they see something or whatever that is. Now, there's a lot of things in bereavement science. Crying is a normal part of grieving. It's also been found, however, that crying and talking about loss is not the only healthy response. If forced or excessive can be harmful. So everyone has different ways. Bereavement, science, so forth. So I'm going to talk about it from a personal point of view. So in dying, I mentioned that my grandma died when I was 10. My grandfather died when I was 13, had a heart attack in front of me, died. I was 15, 15th birthday, my dad was diagnosed, he was in the hospital, diagnosed with cancer and died 7 weeks later. And I've had my dad's brother die, I've had my grandma died at 100, and every one of them griefs is different. So the grief I had from my grandmother, and my grandmother was not a very nice woman, to be honest. It's a horrible thing to say about your grandparents, but my grandmother wasn't a very nice person. She bullied my mum growing up. She gave my mum a lot of complexes, a lot of issues, which my mum as an adult still hasn't got over, I believe. And my mum's 77, so it just shows you that parenting can really fuck you up. But I didn't grieve for my grandmother very much. I was upset she died, but I didn't really have a good relationship with her. I didn't like her very much. I thought she was quite horrible to my mum. I saw how she bullied my mum. I saw how she was horrible to my grandfather when my grandfather looked after when she had a stroke and then after cancer and when she was in a wheelchair. She wasn't a very easy person. She didn't get on with my father either, which was obviously, there was a clash there. So the grief I had for my grandmother was kind of non-existent. I just thought, well, she was ill, she was old, she died. That was it. When my grandfather died, the grief was completely different because I was a lot closer to my grandfather. So my grandfather was someone who helped me read, along with my next door neighbour, Felix, and so forth. So the grief was so different. So when my grandfather died, the shock of him having a heart attack, cried a lot, couldn't understand it, why he had a heart attack. Knowing that he had a heart attack a few months before, the shock of his death was quite an impact for me because he actually died in front of me. And that is sometimes how we process grief. So it's so different. So when we look at grief in a way of how do we understand it, we can look at it in a very different way of our understanding about why we miss things. So there's certain things I miss and I see things and it makes me laugh or reminisce and I remember my grandfather. My grandfather's humour was quite acute. He was from Newcastle he was very arty. He was actually a stained glass window maker, but he was very arty, very particular in his clothing, very dressed to the nines. Like my grandfather dressed really well. Total opposite to my dad, and that's why I've got to explain the difference about different things. So my grandfather was quite influential to me because he was self-employed. He was very well read actually, and he did get me into a lot of understanding spiritual. And if I didn't understand something, he'd buy me a book. Like, right, okay, you want to know about Hinduism? Here's a book. Here's a book about this. Oh, you want to know about this person? And he bought me a lot of books. I mean, I had really bad that actually I got these taken off me at school. I had a book of Mao Zedong. I actually had the Third Reich book, Mein Kampf by Hitler, which he'd somehow got hold of. I don't know how. But I read these things to understand them and to understand different perspectives. And I read about Gandhi and I read about Martin Luther King and I understood this stuff and I'm really well read. I didn't read very much. So my grief of my grandfather was this very much, I was very upset. And I remember actually when my grandfather died, they were clearing up his house 2 weeks. I thought he was talking to me and I ran over to the house. My own parents couldn't find me. And I went there and sat down and I thought I could hear my grandfather talking to me and just talking in his front room and, you know, asked him how things were and what it was like up in heaven and so forth, and really was quite profound. So that grief was quite hard for me and I think I really struggled with it. I remember school friends really struggled. I really struggled. I went really inward. I was quite, though I did music and everything, I was quite an inward child, and actually after my grandfather died I really went inward. But then we look at the grief of my father dying. So my father was ill a few weeks before my 15th birthday, and then when he went to hospital they actually diagnosed that he was riddled with cancer, prostate and colon. And so I saw him deteriorate, and I really struggled with the idea of that my father wasn't going to be around because he was the breadwinner of the family. Didn't speak a lot, my dad. He wasn't probably the biggest talker. He was illiterate. And I didn't always relate to him sometimes because he did mechanics and stuff, so I wasn't physically like that. But he had a lot of spiritual ideas. He would teach me a lot of spiritual things. He actually taught me meditation as a kid. Very much some interesting ideas. And so when my father died, the grief was so different, and that really brought me into my shell. But the weirdest thing is that also by that time, I remember before my father was diagnosed, I was always quite chubby-cheeked, and then when he was like diagnosed, I sort of went slimmed down. I went really skinny, and it was like I'd become a different person. And the weirdest thing is when someone dies like your father, because it's obviously biological, you start noticing things you do, or your characteristics then come from that. And there's obviously characteristics of my mum equally as well. And I think when my mum passes, there will be things I will struggle with. But because now my mum is getting old, she's 77, I feel she's had a good life, so the grief will be different. But with my father, I felt that with the grief, I didn't feel there was things he could have taught me more, and that was the grief I had. It was the disappointment that he passed. But because my grief turned into a form of relief, and I only cried twice actually. I'd never cried at the funeral. I cried on the day after he got diagnosed, and I cried for about 3 hours. I remember being at school. Someone asked me how Dad, I said he's going to die. And I remember crying from like before registration, in assembly, and the first lesson. It was like about 2.5 hours, 3 hours of crying. And after that, never cried again. I think it was the release of it. It was very cathartic. And I always felt that when my dad was dying, I had to be strong. So, and then we're strong for my mum as well. And I had to then become this warrior. And I had to battle family, people trying to rob us, all sorts. You'd be surprised. And then the grief is not just the grief. It's about how family behave with wills and estates. So I've seen that. I've seen the good, if people help you and you really want to help you, do well with that. And then I've seen the other side, people rob you and try and make up lies, and they owe debts to people and they don't pay them back. So I've seen the both sides. The one thing as well then, grief is probably a very important thing. And that was my grandfather and my father, and then my next door neighbour, Felix. Now Felix died about 7-8 months after my father. And he was very old. He actually died at the age of 90, so he had a very good innings. And so that's the English term for saying he lived a good life. It's just like a cricket joke. It's like a pseudonym, I suppose, or a synonym expression. But because my next door neighbour Felix taught me how to decipher information. He was like, taught me theology, he taught me about the Bible, he taught me about religion, he taught me about Islam, he taught me about all this stuff, about cultural stuff. He was very well read. And my grief with him was also quite impacting on me, because it was just before I started my GCSEs, actually my exams. And I remember that being very impacting, and because he did take on like a father figure role. It's very unusual how that happens. And sometimes when you have someone who's a friend or someone who's a family member or someone who's close to the family, that grief can be different as well. And when I look at the way I study and the way I understood information, I would also thank, Felix Underwood, who was this great man. He was amazing. Just someone my parents lived next door to, looked after when he got older. My mum and dad was his carer. But he was great. I mean, he would get me newspapers and read stuff. So my way of looking at information, understanding it, processing it was from him. So this is where grief can alter in very different ways. You can have the very, like my grandma, there wasn't much a closeness. My grandfather was a closeness because of being my grandfather and so forth, and the arty and the entrepreneurial side. My father, because he's my father blood, and some of the opinions he had, he was an atheist. He was against the royals. He was against it, and didn't like inequality and so forth. But he also had some practical ideas and had some really kind of unusual ideas of that. And then my next door neighbour was actually quite spiritual, so he was into religion, theology. He was a theologian. He kind of taught me a lot of stuff. And so when we look at these different things, and then my grandma died 5 years ago when I was in India, and she was 100. Now that was my dad's mum, and she was a wonderful woman, but I wasn't close to her, and it was strange. I when she died, I thought, well, she got to 100, good age. So grief can work in very different ways, and I'm not to say that every grief is worse or better. It's just how we do it, and that's why I'm explaining my personal situations, which most people don't do. So the other thing as well is when we look at bereavement, I would say the worst bereavement is the death of a child. And the death of a child can take the form of a loss of infancy, such as miscarriage, stillbirth, or a thing called SIDS, which is sudden infant death syndrome. Now, what we've got to understand about our ancestors is actually we're lucky that mortality rates are a lot lower. But, for example, if I take my great-grandfather, who I never met, he died in the 60s. He was one of 16 children, and by the time he got to the age of 7, only 3 of his sisters lived. All of the rest of his all of his brothers and sisters all had died. So the actual rate of infant death was so high. So when people go the good old days and Victorian stuff, it wasn't. They had so much death, and that was in England. America and all the other places were just as bad. So when we consider that, when we think, oh, our lives aren't great now, well, they are. Was the way they would have had to deal with death then, they just couldn't talk about it. They weren't allowed to talk about it. It was just like, okay, someone died, baby was born, there's stillbirth. It was common. I mean, if I look at my family, there were so many twins who were born and the twin died. And that's, I would probably say, majority of family lines, going up a line, there's at least 5 or 6 on each side. But it's actually interesting that from my mum's side, when she was born, she didn't have one. My dad didn't have a twin die or anything. But the ones before, they didn't either, but then before then it did. So it just shows you that the idea of that, and now this is where people then get into the idea of grief, is that the idea of why people don't like the idea of abortion. Because abortion then is the idea of the acceptance, okay, a child's like, and we're going to kill a child, because they feel, oh, it's not developed yet. And so there's always this counteraction between spiritual and the practical. Can someone look after a child, right? Back in the old days, people had to have children. But then, see, also people, if they had a child and they didn't know they weren't married, they were seen as they were off-caste, or their children were put into care or fostered. I mean, there was a lot of stuff. So grief could be is quite a huge demographic. And the idea of a deaf child, I think, would be the worst. I think that's the worst, because it's something which you would never believe would happen. You always think a child would outlive you. But there's actually studies now that they reckon a lot of parents, if you were born after 1980, is your parents will outlive you. That seems to be a lot of common studies are coming out. I don't believe it, but I think it's an idea. But there we go, I don't know. Suicide, I've mentioned this as a video before, so if you ever wanted to look at that, I've done a video talking about suicide, also my own experience of nearly trying to commit suicide. families, parents, that's really hard for people to deal with. And I've dealt with clients in hypnotherapy who have had a child commit suicide, or a husband or a partner, and that can be incredibly difficult situations, very emotional, but there is a lot of resolvement of them. They are some of my favourite, as I say favourite, it's a bit of a weird thing to say, but it's my probably best studies I've done, and my best cases I've done, and I find they're very rewarding for the client as well as yourself. Death of a spouse, obviously I've had the experience. So my grandfather, how he responded when my grandma died. I think a bit of relief, but also struggled. He only died about 3-4 years after my grandma, so he didn't live long. That's quite common. After my dad died, my mum really went into depression, suffered SAD, could really struggle with grief, because obviously she'd had her mum dying wasn't a big issue, but her dad dying, they were close, and then my father dying was really impacting her. And I think she was always worried that if she died, how would I be looked after? But I had godparents, but that is something that was always concerning my mum. And so the death of a spouse is describing losing half themselves, which I think is incredibly difficult. So the death of a child, then I think the death of a spouse is incredibly hard. And you see people dealing with it in different ways. So people, sometimes the death of a spouse, they go travelling, they go and find themselves, they go, some people sometimes get remarried quickly, but it's not actually because they want to be married, it's because they actually don't want to be lonely. That's a big issue. Death of a sibling, another one. I don't have siblings, so I don't have a problem with that. Death of a parent for an adult. An adult child loses parents in later adulthood is considered to be timely and to be normative. So that's where in development, people typically lose parents after the age of 50. I lost my father at 15, but my mum I'm 42, so I don't think my mum will last before I'm 45, but again, my parents were older, so I've always sort of known they were going to pass eventually. For a child, it's very difficult. Adolescents really struggle with that. I didn't so much, but people do. And loss during a childhood. So they can see that parent-child caregiver dies, leaves children in major depression. Children grow older, death is still hard to fathom, affects how a child responds. But I don't think if children are taught about death correctly, it's never a problem. So I would say loss of a friend, I've had that. I've had a friend of mine die of drug overdose. I've had a friend of mine die of cancer. There was a girl in my year group. Everyone deals with things differently, but all of them, again, because although I was close to them, they weren't my best friend or something like that. One of them dealt with drugs, he was a good friend of mine, but we'd also lost contact and lost friendship. So we have all these different things, and I feel that the best way we can help with bereavement and grief is discussing it, talking about it, setting up groups, going to bereavement places, creating forums and so forth. And that to me is the best way of dealing with grief. And as a hypnotherapist, I think it's a very important thing of my job is to actually help people get over grief or get over the death of someone. And that's not to rid it or get rid of their memories, it's nothing like that. It's actually about accepting it and how to work forward with it, and then to hopefully not commit suicide or cause more problems, and just help people change their outlook. It's very important. I think it's probably one of my most interesting things I have to deal with, and I do enjoy that work. I do enjoy people connecting to their death of their loved ones or something. I think it can be really cathartic, real good healing. That to me, I think is real healing, and you can help people in abundance on that. So until next time, and after the next week, I'm going to share the videos about the Hinduism idea of afterlife, reincarnation and so forth, and see what you think. But until next time, and as of Friday, this Friday Fears, I'm going to be talking about the fear of death and then the fear of the unknown, so it kind of interrelates. Anyway, until next time.